This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So we're sort of going through some housekeeping stuff here. We're kind of rebranding. It's not really, I guess, maybe not the best description of what's going on, but we are moving to a creative network for creators at Zencastr. Part of that move was based on an invitation that they gave us. We already used their product, so we were going to move over there. And what I think we've decided is the best way to describe this moving forward is this is a true crime talk show. It's basically you and I talking about what's been in the news and some of the literal excesses of true crime. Would you agree that's an accurate description?
Yes.
We'll be doing that going forward. And one of the things that we're going to incorporate into some of this is we're going to be talking to some authors, some family members of victims of true crime. I guess family members in a lot of cases are also victims themselves. That's probably
I agree with that.
I saw, I want to mention this, but I don't really want to go into the names and stuff. But, so this missing persons case from like the 90s just sort of wrapped up suddenly. And I shared it with you this morning. It was multiple people. I think I would describe it as people who just didn't want to be found by the reporting parties. Do you ever wonder how many of the cases that we look at are like that?
I don't wonder because I know when they are.
Okay.
Even if it could be wrong. Like even if I'm making the wrong assessment on it, I immediately assess those type of cases. And I chuck them most of the time. I won't entertain them for very long, except just to say, like, I feel like that's probably a domestic issue. Now, there's all kinds of underlying things, right? And, the case that we were sort of looking at that came to a rapid close, the situation was a small child disappeared with the mother and the child's mother and the child's mother's partner, right?
Yeah, like a step-parent role, I think, would be the best way to describe that.
Yeah, so 2 adults and 1 child, and then there was another child left behind with the father. And they had joint custody. And for whatever reason, the mom left with the one daughter, and the other daughter was left behind with the father. And after she left, the father went back to court and got custody of both of the girls and essentially undid the joint custody. But up until, I don't know where I fall on that, except my first inclination is it's none of my business, except, we find out as the case is being brought completely closed, like 25 years later, that the FBI has been involved. And so that makes it a public matter, right?
Yeah, in this case, it wasn't just the FBI. It was also the U.S. Marshals, which I found that was interesting because that means they were actively looking for them. The FBI would be like they have it on a list. They put it on their website. They may be investigating it at times, but the U.S. Marshals do some pretty active looking.
Right, and you asked me an interesting question because I said that this type of case, so if anything is classified as like a domestic issue, a lot of times I feel like it's not the right place to discuss it on our show, but that doesn't mean that it's any less of a crime, right? Except that, we don't know everything that was happening, but I make the assumption that she left 1 child behind and took 1 child with her, right? And I imagine she was saying, I'm going to take 1, you have 1, right? It's whatever skewed logic that is. However, I don't feel like it's a lot of my business to be getting into other people's business, but I said this isn't really a missing persons case as much as it is like, oh no, I had a kid with the wrong person. Now what type of case? And then you said, well, who is responsible for like this ginormous waste of resources? And I don't really know, but okay, so the father in this case was the one that I assume is pushing to find these missing people, right?
I think the push was for the missing kid.
Right, and they issued a warrant for something. It
It
wasn't
would be
kidnapping.
it was like it would be what today would be like a parental alienation or a parental interference charge. It would be like it was literally called child stealing at one point.
Okay. Well, and see, it that gets into some, dicey territory because from what I've seen, and I haven't looked in this very deeply, they had joint custody, right? And I'm sure that I don't know if it was court appointed or if they had just agreed to it or what. But, with joint custody, that means like you've got co parenting happening on both sides. And you both, a lot of times, you're both parents and you both have the right to do all kinds of things, right? And you
And the
work
responsibility.
and the responsibility, yes. But part of that I mean, so it's a tricky situation because when you're sharing joint custody of a child, you want to be sharing it with somebody who's not going to run off with your child, right? That's the idea there. Because most parents, well, ideally parents, they say, well, it's not in my child's best interest for me to run off and keep her away from her father, right? That's the ideal situation.
I
It's
would
not
agree
all
with that.
That's not always what happens, but uh, in a lot of cases, in the best cases of children whose parents are not married, that's what you would hope for, right? Just having
Yeah.
two parents
Yeah.
that care about you and they don't have to get along, but they have to co-parent to whatever extent that is. That's not the case here. But I feel like so she had a warrant and it was a felony, I believe. And I
Yeah.
assume that's why the US Marshals would be involved. Because they were actually looking to apprehend a fugitive. And I noticed, and I don't know who was pushing for the investigation that you were talking about. I got the feeling it might have been the sister.
Yeah, I think this might have been some folks who cared that were maybe not in the immediate family of the children, but were like, aunts, uncles. Those people were sort of pushing to get the story out there. And that's how this all was finally kind of wrapped up.
Right. And so, in that type of situation, you've got a 4-year-old who is taken from half of her family. And at this point, it's 25 years later, she'd be 29 years old. And that's not a missing child anymore.
No, not at all. That's an adult who wants their identity back, I'm assuming.
Well, I feel like she could have taken her identity back if she wanted to.
Well, I try to be very careful in how I talk about these situations because, on the one hand, particularly with the stuff that we do here, the research, the investigation that we do related to what we're putting onto the True Crime Access feed, that tends to be about serial killers and strange disappearances. But I try to keep in mind that there are victims out there that are just dealing with whatever is going on right in front of them. And there definitely could be some missing people we come across in those cases. I think you call them domestics, uh, that we're just not aware of whatever perspective they have or whatever they might have been going through in terms of trauma or abuse or just mental health crises. There's a number of things that happen to them. I try to be aware of that being a possibility in all of these cases. That not everybody is good people. And that's one of the things true crime talks about is people who aren't great, but also not everybody gets caught for what they do. Some people run away
That's
from them.
That's true. And I do have sort of a generalized mindset that without other information, right? Because I would literally do anything to protect just about any child. Okay, but they're not all my children, right? I have my child, but without additional information indicating a problem beyond the fact that this, that a parent has left with their child and to the other parent they are missing, right? Beyond that, so, not knowing the underlying circumstances, I have to assume that the best place for any child would be with one of their parents, right? Um, and so if there's more information, that makes it a little bit different. Like if you know for a fact this person has made threats against the children or whatever, right? Um, I think I told you, like the majority of the time you've got a child who's supposed to be with both parents is only with one and is not in contact with the other one. Typically, those situations involve something that has nothing to do with the child, and it really probably shouldn't even involve law enforcement. It's two adult parents not getting along. That's typically what happens there.
Yeah, I've looked at the statistics on that, and I tend to agree with you, particularly with like if you look at it in terms of how many people there are in the U.S. and how many people are parents and how many kids there are, uh, there are there are a number of cases that would lend to abuse. But if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, it's not quite as great as you would think.
Well, and that it's always been very surprising to me after we started doing this and sort of like grouping different cases together the way that we do in our research, that it was really surprising to me how many of these cases I felt like with like with a different set of circumstances and some guidance, these children wouldn't be missing children. Like they would just be they would be children of a split family, right? That's
Yeah,
what they would be. And there's always stuff that comes into play with that. But and so I don't know. Like, yes, the FBI has spent 25 years looking for this child who is now 29 years old. They've been found safely, and then another one of my big pet peeves that's sort of coming, like I'm just really seeing it recently, is when, like, for example, this family, whoever asked for this investigation for it to be put out, like on a platform, right? All of a sudden it's come, full circle and they found them and now they want their privacy, right?
yeah. Well, so you look at that perspective, which is interesting because I thought that about you, but I don't think I had confirmed it. And then I look at it and I go, all right, so this is going to be a DOJ press release and the FBI and the U.S. Marshals and whoever. And I'm not belittling those resources at all, but they say they've been looking for these people for 25 years. And I sort of go, well, why didn't you find them? I mean, because now you found them. Like, what was stopping you before? And how much of
Right.
that time did you really spend looking for them versus how does that sound better in the press release than 25 years later? Here they are. I mean, that like I it doesn't matter if it's state, local, federal. I question a lot of the terminology used
Well,
to.
it's all used to, sort of exalt the agency responsible for closing the case, right?
That's what I think. I just
Well,
don't
yeah.
like the exaltations necessarily.
Well, no, you want to add a boy and a pat on your back for doing your job? I mean, you should just do your job. And I know that sounds really bad. I shouldn't say that, but I'm just, I feel like if you're going to push things and you're going to say help me, right? I want the public to help me. And then you don't want to share the outcome, whatever it is, right? I feel like that's wrong.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, and I will say this, like, because there's several federal and law enforcement people that listen to us. So I'm going to just say it this way: those guys are humans, and the people, the humans, the bulk of the ones that I know and have met and have interacted with, the vast majority of them are good humans doing good work for good causes. So I want to make sure I say it that way. My problem is with the agencies and how everything becomes this like machine. And even cases like this are sort of like, for every case they close like this, there are 10 that I go, well, what's going on with that one? There's a very similar case to this that was out of North Carolina. We've talked about it, where like basically an entire family sort of goes missing. And it's another one of like your qualifications for it, where we probably need to figure out a more specific timeline and a route of travel. I think this is a car case, is how you put it. And you were like, I don't know if it's a wrecked car or a car in water or what, but for those 4 people to go poof, I think it's a car case. And for people who aren't familiar, they're about to get familiar with this. We have started tracking another serial killer. We make this massive list at the beginning of victims, and you use cases like this one that we're talking about, where they're closing it after 25 years. I'm assuming that's how you get here. You use your sort of your qualifications in those cases to help me check off like who is a likely victim, isn't a likely victim, and who seems like we should probably look into them more. Is that an accurate statement?
I think so. I would say like it's just instinct, but I don't. It's not really just instinct, because it after somehow the way we set everything up, right? And so let's say anytime we're investigating a situation, if you just randomly were to go on NamUs, which, that's missing and unidentified, missing people and unidentified bodies, it's the national database for that. Or if you were just track violent crime, either sexual assaults or murders. And if you just start kind of grouping that together, most of the time you're looking probably time-wise and geographical location, right?
Yeah.
And you start getting data, basically. And as we're doing that, like, you start to see like hints, right? Like hints that things are connected to one another. And I always thought before we did this, and sort of when we were starting this, that it would always be like way too much information to ever process, right? But that's not really the case. It's actually really surprising how, I don't want to say easy, but maybe how obvious some cases are. But do you think that would be like accurate? Because you think, well, people get killed all the time, or people go missing all the time. But if you start looking in 5 or 6 states, and suddenly you see this theme where young ladies, and by that I mean they're driving, so over 16, to 30, so 16 to 30-year-old women suddenly are disappearing from their vehicles. They're perfectly fine working vehicles, right? Like, and all of a sudden you see 5 or 6 of them over 10 years. You're like, wow, I wonder if those had something to do with one another.
We had this thing, and this is before we did this, before we did any of what we're doing now. So pre 2013, we had this thing that I think we both always wondered about, and that is, how do they come up with these numbers for missing people, where they throw out 600,000 people are reported missing each year? And like, okay, that's a huge number.
The problem is that that's not how the statistic is used. They say that like there are 600,000 missing people. That's
Right.
what is said, and that's not true.
Right. So what we've discovered is there's a lot of patterns in this information. And, for instance, like we expand and contract timeline and geography as we're starting to investigate something. And this, even though this is an interview episode, we're going to interview somebody later in this episode who has done a lot of research about a couple of particular cases. But with us, we expand and contract the information as we're developing the timeline for the person who's sort of at the center of it all. And that person overlaps with what we're going to interview later. But when I first like put it all together, I was like, oh, there's 120 names. That's easy to look at. We'll just look at that. So I went and found a timeline of this person's life, and I was going through the timeline, and I could see like major events, and I was like, wait a second, his age is this. So I expand the timeline portion, meaning where I had been looking at like 1992 to 2002, and then for whatever reason, I said I really need to go back further. So I went back to I think 1986, and something about the timeline that I had. I stole part of one and put together my own and another version. But whatever was going on with the timeline, I was like, I actually need to be going back even further to 1980. And I realized that I needed to add some other geographic locations. So you had a better way to break everything down in this instance where you helped me out by age. But suddenly you're looking at 600 cases. And it's not that this guy is responsible for 600 people. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that's what you have to look at to develop a cohesive story. And to account for the different patterns that you see. So what we start pulling out of there are folks that likely had an accident with their car. We pull those out.
That's the first and foremost. That's the easiest one for me. Usually.
Yeah, I'd say if the car hasn't been found, it's definitely the easiest one to sort of put a pin on. I do think there's cases that potentially could be missed if we relied on it too much. So I know that you go and do additional digging.
I look at I don't just look for like, well, were they driving a car that hasn't been found? I look at like the rest of the case, right? Or the rest of the circumstances surrounding the missing people, right?
Yeah. That's when we get into where we can identify if there's mental health crises that are potentially going on. Sometimes you can tell. It's hard to like sort of cohesively explain this, but I'd say it sort of goes like this: if you have someone who's been missing multiple times, they've run away, they've been checked into mental health facilities, and suddenly they come up missing, and their family is genuinely looking for them. Their cars accounted for, their keys and their cell phone are sitting on the table in their house, and the front door was unlocked. You can get a good idea. Like you can literally kind of look at cases and go, well, that person went off and maybe that's drug related, or this person seems to have made a conscious decision to enter the wilderness. And if they have a history, it's hard to ignore the coincidences that would have to occur for someone to be taken by a serial predator, but also have been threatening suicide in the weeks prior to their disappearance, if you can verify that's accurate information.
Right. And I always go off of what people who knew the person have said, right? I mean, not to the extent that I would exclude somebody like making up a story, right?
Right.
But you can get a lot of information about the circumstances leading up to the disappearance.
Yeah, and the same thing occurs with domestic cases. If you've got one parent threatening to take the children from another parent, and that goes on for a year, and suddenly one of the children disappears, a lot of times you can look at that and go, well, the likelihood of Ted Bundy taking a child in the middle of a contentious custody suit and the kid completely vanishing, that's not realistic
At all.
So, that's how you can kind of rule out like who went where and who did what. Sometimes you can see runaways. It's not always the case. Like sometimes runaways can be a higher risk.
That would be the trickiest one, probably. I am quick to classify certain people as runaways, right? But I would have to say, and most of the time I'm right. Like if I tracked it, I would be correct, because those people aren't missing for very long because they come back, right? Or they're located otherwise. But I have to say, the runaways that are gone for what we've been researching recently, there's not going to be a whole lot of runaways in those, because runaways, if they run away and they're still gone like 30 years later, something happened.
Yeah, I'd say for me, probably runaways is up there. It's probably the top 3, but I think the hardest 2 types of victims for me are men who go missing in the wilderness That's a hard one for me. Probably the hardest one is when people are involved in sex work coupled with drugs. Those are the hardest ones to track because you get to a point in time where they were off the radar. They weren't really on the radar on a regular basis. And when they sort of disappear, like with the guys that go into the wilderness, you can track their cases through like how they went into the wilderness and when and what they were supposed to be doing afterwards. With people who are off the radar, and this is men, women, whoever, um, that are engaged in high risk lifestyles, particularly certain types of drug dealing, certain types of sex work. Um, you don't really know when they were supposed to appear next. So you lose the beginning of your timeline and you have to sort of go, well, this is when someone thought to report them missing. And this is when someone seems to have last verified they were alive. And it's getting easier today because like there's cell phone records that suddenly disappear from things. People text from Ubers to 911 and say something's happening. But it is still difficult for me for those three. I would say high risk lifestyles is the top one. Men in the wilderness.
Well, I think that you're skewed by men in the wilderness because of Keys.
Probably am, but there's still cases like that that happen today. And this is okay. So I made a gender differential there that I should probably explain a little bit. Women in the wilderness tend to get looked for pretty quickly.
I think so. I mean, well, quickly, as far as like when it's realized that they're not accounted for somehow.
Yeah, and like I'm definitely skewed by Keys on the men in the wilderness cases because I weirdly would never have had a reason to look at men in the wilderness cases until I started like researching him. And like
Right.
weirdly, that doesn't tie into the next things that we're doing. I don't think that the men in the wilderness have anything to do with this next set of cases we're going to cover. So they
No,
don't.
nothing at all. But it is interesting because I think the very reason that it suddenly like shoots off red flags is because it never would have been a thing before. Because a man that goes out into the wilderness and doesn't come back, he either succumbed to the elements or he, decided to live out his last days in the wilderness. That's the assumption that's made, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so when all of a sudden you're listening to a serial killer talking about how like he would hunt people and, in remote areas and take them because when people go missing in the wilderness, it happens all the time, right? And you're going, whoa, right? Because that's really scary because while I don't feel like it does happen all the time as far as people not ever being found, it is something you feel like a guy in the wilderness. He either got lost and or got hurt or whatever, and or he decided not to come back out. Right? You don't
Yeah.
see it as a situation, and I feel like people going into the wilderness, they don't think of it as like, oh, this is dangerous, right? I don't know, but it seems like a guy would be like, I can take care of myself, right? And it's just, I actually make the very gender biased assumption that most middle aged men who go missing for some reason, like it's either directly or indirectly through their own choices. They're not they're not going to be victims the majority of the time.
Yeah. I mean, I used to think that way. Now I have a lot more questions about that.
Well, and the circumstances surrounding the cases, that's I can sometimes those are helpful in deducing like what we have to look at, right?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I so one of my cases that has always been stuck in my head is Scott Lilly. So Scott Lilly, the reason this is Stonewall. Do you remember this case from? We talked about him during Israel Keys. This is the guy that went missing on the Appalachian Trail up at it was the George Washington National Forest at Cow Camp, and then they found his body, but they never found his gear. His case is from August 2011, and I always think of that guy because here's why. He stands out to me because he's a clear-cut case of murder. He died by asphyxiation. So, and then he was like partially buried. His case is one of those that like will haunt me as like what can happen to a dude that's just out and about hiking. And when I think of him, because he was like 30, I think he was 30 years old when he went missing. He was from Indiana. He was just out on the trail, and his case for some reason has always bothered me. So when I think about him, I can't help but think of the case of today's focus, I guess. We have a special guest, I think would be the best way to phrase it. Wouldn't you think?
Yes.
So this is from, she's done more than what we're going to talk about here. She's an award-winning journalist, and she does a lot of science writing. She finished up her work at St. Louis University for a bachelor's degree. She got her master's of arts and her doctorate, and I think her doctorate's in English, from the University of Delaware. She was a longtime editor of The Hawk and the Handsaw up at Unity, which ends up serving as sort of a it's almost a character itself in this story, but it's a college where she served as a professor of environmental studies and writing from 2001 to 2015. She has since taught in several different graduate programs and low residency Masters of Fine Arts programs, including most recently, according to her website, at Green Mountain College. And she was also their writer in residence. She is the author of 4 previous books, Adventures with Ari, All Standing, Superstorm, and Quakeland. I have not read those, but what I have read is her most recent book, and that is Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. She has a lot more credits in here, but the description for Trailed is, in May of 1996, 2 skilled backcountry leaders were found brutally murdered at their remote campsite in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park, which is adjacent to the world-famous Appalachian Trail. And despite an extensive decades-long joint investigation by the FBI, the National Park Service investigators, and the Virginia State Police, this case has never been solved. So on the 20th anniversary of this infamous crime, the award-winning journalist and author Kathryn Miles embarked on a passionate search for justice that resulted in a true crime must-read, and that is Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders.
Okay, so the overview of this case, there's a Strange Outdoors article that's fantastic. This is from December 28, 2020, and here's what it said. The unsolved Williams and Winans camping murders in Shenandoah National Park. On Sunday, May 19th, 1996, Julie Williams, 24, and Lolly Winans, 26, set out with their golden retriever, Taj, to hike through the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. During their stay in the park, they were brutally murdered at a tranquil campsite, despite suspicions that a Columbia, Maryland man was the perpetrator. The case against them fell apart. The FBI says they are still investigating the murders of Julie and Lolly, but 24 years on, now 26 years on, the case is still open and unsolved. For good background about the couple, I'm going to direct you to Trail, but they have a little bit of background in this article, but here's what I'm going to read about this hiking trip. After a day of walking, Julie and Lolly pitched their tent off of one of Shenandoah National Park's horse trails in a secluded area, and they settled down for the night. They chose a peaceful spot that was like right next to a mountain stream near what was known as the Bridle Trail. It's part of the horse trail system that runs from Big Meadows to Skyland in the park. On May 31st, the authorities were notified by Thomas Williams, who's Julie's father, that the women were missing, and park rangers set out looking for them. They found their car parked near Skyland Lodge, and they began a search of nearby trails. Park rangers quickly found their dog, Taj, walking around without a leash, but there's no sign of the women. The chief deputy ranger at Shenandoah National Park, Bridget Bonet, said, "We started doing these hasty searches to cover all of the trail corridors in that general area to see if we could locate them. And at some point during those quick searches, we did locate the dog." On June 1st, 1996, searchers came across a camp about a half mile from the vehicle with the bodies of Julie and Lolly. National Park Service lead investigator Tim Alley. Now, Tim features prominently in the book Trailed. He said that Lolly was found inside the tent, and like Julie, she had been gagged. Her hands had been bound with duct tape that oddly had first been used to tape Julie's mouth, and her throat had been slit. Unlike Julie, her ankles were also bound. Both were partially undressed, yet neither woman had been sexually assaulted, or at least they did not find semen on her and their bodies. Julie's body, along with her sleeping bag and her sleeping pad, was approximately 30 to 40 feet away, and it was down a little embankment. The bodies were undiscovered in such a popular part of the park on a busy holiday weekend because, as Bonet explains, one of the backcountry regulations at the time was that backpackers had to camp away from designated trails, fire roads, and developed areas. She says it wasn't a heavily used or heavily traveled trail, and they were following the rules at the time, which required them to be out of sight. There was a camera discovered at the camp with photos of their hike along the White Oak Canyon Trail. They had also climbed Hawksbill, which is the highest mountain in Shenandoah, just before they pitched camp for the last time, which is a few days after they entered the park. The Park Service waited around 36 hours after the discovery to announce the murders, even though the park was full of visitors who may have been at risk. When the announcement was finally made, acting park superintendent Greg Stiles called it an isolated incident without providing any basis for such a statement. And the FBI announced shortly thereafter that the murders appeared to be random. So Trailed goes into sort of the sprawling investigation that happens here. And as I'm listening to all of this, and as you guys are listening to it, keep in mind that this is still on the FBI's most wanted page. It's still on their VICAT page. But one of the interesting things about this murder is while it's mentioned in multiple places on the internet, it doesn't even have its own Wikipedia page. I think one of the mentions I found was in the Colonial Parkways killing page. The way that this murder was treated by investigators and by the folks who are responsible for public information being released it's a big deal. They think at one point that they have their man. Ultimately, that turns out to be highly unlikely, if not completely impossible. And Trailed follows this story in a way that gets into much more detail than we have time to cover right here. But I wanted to kind of give a nutshell overview of what sort of kicked off this part of things. And this is going to be the story of Julie and Lolly that we're covering here with the author of Trailed.
What's interesting about this case, Lolly Winans and Julie Williams is the case that is focused on here. It's sort of how it took turns court-wise. In early 2002, in response to mounting political pressure, Attorney General John Ashcroft announced that he would be seeking the death penalty against a man named Daryl David Rice, who was in prison for assaulting another woman. And it would be the first capital case tried under new post 9/11 federal hate crime legislation. And then 2 years later, the DOJ quietly dropped the case against Rice. And the investigation into the murder of Lolly Winans and Julie Williams has gone cold. This is one of those cases for me, I think is similar to how Kristen Smart was for you. I was very much out in the world, like in the wilderness. I love, camping, hiking, and all those things. Plus, this case took place from about 3.5 hours away from where I went to college, give or take. Do you remember this case?
I don't know that I remember it when it happened, but I was familiar with the case before we looked into it. Yeah.
I remember the pictures of them that were in the news, and I was very much under the impression that this case had like a very strong prime suspect. And we decided the easiest way to do this, like I said, we're rebranding a little bit here, but I did want to start including more of these opportunities we get to interview other people who are as obsessed with true crime stuff as we are.
And I think that is definitely the case here.
Yeah, I will say one of the descriptors in the PR that I got from this said the trails chronicled Miles' all-consuming obsession to solve this notorious case. It offers an examination of the disturbing legacy of violence against women in America's national parks. And Trail provides a look at the lives and legacies of this extraordinary young couple who had met, fallen in love while working at a world-renowned outdoor program for women, and illuminates the root of sexism and bigotry against BIPOC and LGBTQ plus people in the outdoor community. So I have some questions for her. Do you have some questions as we bring her on?
I do.
All right, so let's get to that and invite her to join our conversation.
What we're talking about is Trailed, and so let me just be the 10 millionth person to tell you this is an amazing book. It's really good. I loved everything you did with it, but I think probably my favorite part is you captured this this element of true crime where people go down a rabbit hole, and you shared your rabbit hole with us.
Yeah, whether you want to be in my rabbit hole or not, there it is.
It's such a different book from everything else that I've read about you. Was this the first really deep true crime dive that you did, or just the first one that you're publishing and sharing with us?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I guess prior to this book, really thought of myself primarily as a science writer. And so I had addressed some issues of crime, but I was always coming at it either from the trail and the wilderness perspective as an environmental writer, or I was coming at it from looking at things like the scientific veracity of forensic testing and how much we can really tease out from things like DNA analysis and things like that. So that had always been my way in. But this particular case has been one that has been with me for over 25 years now. And so while it took quite a while before I thought I'm going to dedicate myself to a book about this, it's a case that's been very much on my mind, almost since it happened.
This is a terrible tragedy, and somehow you sort of approached it from the perspective of, I want to get as much light out of their lives. You get very personal with Lolly and Julie. That's the perspective I had as a reader. Was that what you were going for as a writer?
Absolutely. I love true crime. I listen to podcasts and, stream all sorts of things. But, one of my complaints about the genre, or at least some examples of the genre, are the way in which it seems like victims almost become objects, and they almost become these sort of flat secondary characters to these very well-rounded perpetrators, and I get that, serial killers are endlessly fascinating, for instance, but that's always kind of bothered me about the genre. And then, from a very personal perspective, in so many ways, Lolly and Julie were my contemporaries, and had I known them, I would have thought they were the coolest humans on the planet. And then having taught at the college that Lolly attended when she was murdered, she was just everywhere on that campus, and her friends became my friends, and her professors were my colleagues. And so for many, many years now, I've felt like I've sort of been living in the aura of Lolly. And so it was really important to me that other people got to live there too.
It was interesting. I think that personal connection almost made Unity a sort of a character. I mean, I know there were characters at Unity, but the college itself sort of becomes a pretty important part of the story. Yeah,
it's a really remarkable school, or was, I should say. It's moved on to a very different iteration. But, for Lolly, it was the first place where she really found a sense of community and purpose. And, I think I would probably say the same for me. It was sort of this throwback to the late 1960s in terms of environmentalism and activism and this kind of crunchy, it's all good culture that was really great.
my wife got her master's in upstate New York, and she was at a state school that's pretty similar to that. I found that the community, I guess maybe it's the community that is the character, sort of the overarching collection of people that you have. I come from like the theater world was where I did my undergraduate. So I had that kind of community that I was around. And you and we're a little closer in age than I realized. We grew up in this time where we came out of sort of stranger danger to DNA.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a marked difference. I don't know if you remember McGruff the crime dog.
I sure do.
I always think of McGruff coming to our school and warning us not to go with strangers and all of the things that happened there. You captured like this really important element. I don't know how to explain, but it's almost like you and I were, and partially probably Meg as well, we were sort of moving through time as the internet was developing and as DNA was becoming a thing. And one of the really interesting things about this case with Lolly and Julie is you kind of have to balance this, horrible tragedy in the woods. It's a horrible murder. It's a double murder. But then it's got this political element to it where as the nation was trying to deal with certain things, they very much put this front and center as the very first hate crime prosecution that's going to take place.
Yeah, so 1996, right? And I think we forget just how difficult it was to be LGBTQ plus, and we didn't even have all those initials in 1996.
It was a different time. I mean, kids today, like I know they still have their struggles as teenagers, and I think of these guys because they would have been a little older than me, and I picture how hard that must have been. How did you go about making all of that? And what I mean is the timeliness of how this was politicized, the tragedy, and your own experiences growing up. How did you manage to make that into a cohesive story in terms of whatever personal thing you want to say, or just from the timeline? Like, how did you put all that together?
Yeah, so the final product, the actual book, has a few different narrative threads to it, right? It has the sort of TikTok narrative of the crime and the subsequent investigation. It has the narrative of me kind of falling down, as you said, this rabbit hole of this sort of increasingly frenzied attempt to push the investigation forward. And then the other braid that I really wanted to be front and center was this braid of Lolly and Julie, who they were as people, which is extraordinary. This relationship, which by all accounts was just this wonderful, began as a love affair and then became a committed relationship, and really making sure that people understand just how hard that was in 1996. I graduated from college, I think probably the weekend they were murdered, based on what we know from the medical examiner's report. So I remember very vividly, and I'm now old enough that, 20 years go by, and I'm like, so a few years ago, this thing happened, because it's just so vivid in my mind. And the 1990s, we're sort of nostalgia for it today, but it was an era of a lot of uncertainty. It was an era of some really violent crimes. Lolly and Julie were murdered 2.5 years before Matthew Shepard, which is a case your listeners probably know about. And so making sure that people understand kind of where we were as a country then, and then where we were, and I think this is maybe what you were alluding to, where we were as a country in the months after September 11th, and making sure we understand the sort of historical resonance of both of these moments.
In some ways, the internet changed everything because you can kind of go over to this little thing you stick in your pocket that could probably power a spaceship. And, you can look up anything. There was a time when September 11th was the scary hallmark of my life. And I think that's a scary hallmark of a lot of people's lives. But 20-year-olds today, they weren't even alive when it happened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like Pearl Harbor to them.
Yeah, it's like this thing that's so far in the distant past. I think of it as 3 years ago, no matter what. And it's really, 20 years ago now. Do you mind if I ask particulars about the book, or
No,
are the
please.
things you
Yeah,
want
that'd
to
be
keep
great.
secret?
Nope.
So you have these wonderful characters that you met. You call them the Anns. They're like a group that would have been on the trails together. And I guess their first names are all Ann. Is that the idea?
3 of the 5 are named Anne.
So you talk about this picture that they have where they run into a guy who knows too much on the trail. This is after the murders of Lolly and Julie, but it's sort of before it's become a thing. One of the running narratives in the case is sort of how the publicity unfolds. Did they actually take a photo of the guy that they reference in the book?
They did.
Did they
Yeah.
have it?
So they did. And so just a little backstory. So we think this murder occurred on or around May 28th, 1996. As you were saying, this is pre-internet, pre-PDF files, pretty much anything digital. So what I have is, boxes and boxes and boxes of FBI teletypes and handwritten notes and things like that. And as I was going through them, I found the story of these women named Anne who had been in the park, and the park made this, in my opinion, catastrophically bad decision to withhold information about these murders. The women's bodies were discovered in the evening on June 1st of 96. And at that point, and I should say, by way of background, they were bound and gagged. Their hands were duct taped behind their backs. Their throats were slit, and they were found about 30 yards apart, wrapped up in their sleeping bags. At first, the park said, well, maybe we have a bear attack, which is, I don't even think Yogi Bear is obviously capable of this, right? And then the park said, well, maybe what we have here is a murder-suicide, as if, again, that's even remotely possible, given what we know about the facts of the case. And so the park made this internal decision that they were not going to release any information having to do with this case, even after they knew it was a double murder and a very violent, well-organized murder. And so for about 3 days, they withheld information. But meanwhile, they're undertaking one of the region's biggest crime scene investigations in recorded history. So word is starting to get out that something really bad happened on this trail. And so the Anns, who are embarking upon their first backpacking trip and so excited to be in Shenandoah National Park, are starting to hear word that and rumors that this murder has occurred. And as they are getting closer and closer to the murder scene, it's almost this kind of Hollywood movie scene where they're literally walking into this murder zone. They're stopping to ask rangers if they should be worried. They're hearing rumors that this violent crime had occurred. The rangers are like, no, nothing's wrong. You're fine. And, for them, that was so shocking and disappointing and infuriating, and they still hold those feelings really strongly today. And I really wanted to include their story in the book because that experience seemed so emblematic of so many park goers that month who were really looking to the park and the rangers and the FBI to keep them safe, and who felt really betrayed because they weren't given the knowledge to decide if they wanted to occupy the same park as a serial killer.
You did a good job. Not just, it's good for their story, but it's also, I think you sort of captured the feeling of having been tangentially related to something tragic and terrifying that when it happened, you didn't know what had happened with these characters. Were you able to see the photo? Did they have that photo that you describe in the book?
They sent me a roll of film, including that particular photo, which they had sent to the FBI, but never heard a response from the FBI. So yeah, they did send me, they kept their negatives, because again, this is pre-digital photography, right? And so they had kept their negatives. And so they did go back and make copies of everything from that roll of film and send them to me.
Did you see anyone in there that you
Was it
recognized?
relevant?
I did not see anyone that I recognized as a suspect.
We were dying to know if it was either.
That was the very first question I had was,
Yeah.
did she see the picture and is it relevant to, the further investigation that was done? Because that's what I wanted to know. It was really interesting that the guy had information that it didn't seem like he should have, but it could be explained away innocently, right? I really wanted to know if you had gotten to see it and if it, if it gave you any clues to anything.
Yeah, so this is, and it is really spooky, and it is one of multiple things that cannot be explained, and I think certainly require additional attention in the book. So they meet this guy the morning after the murders, or no, the morning after the bodies have been discovered, but that information has not been released to anyone other than the parents of the victims at that point. And they meet this guy early in the morning, about 30 miles away from the murder scene. He's a backpacker. He should have no knowledge of this whatsoever. And he approaches them and he says, did you hear about the murders? Again, that has never been successfully explained. He's not one of the suspects that I name in the book based on the photo, but we still don't know who he is, and we still don't know how or why he knows things that he just shouldn't have known.
That having been said, I always like to find out when it comes to this. Was there anything that you really wanted to be in the book that for either legal reasons or sort of editing or ethical reasons, it just didn't make it in?
Well, again, I have, 4,000 pages of documents. And so, again, trying to narrow that down to a 400-page book is really tricky. I think that I lay out everything that I wanted to lay out in terms of allowing readers to kind of see firsthand the case against Darrell Rice, the man who was indicted in 2002, the case that I make about this other individual, Richard Mark Ivanitz, and then these sort of fringe figures who also, I think, require some additional investigation. I think I make the case there as solidly as I can in terms of legality. Certainly, as part of the book publishing process, the book goes through a fact check and through a libel read with an attorney, and certainly glad to be able to sort of provide all the documentation to make sure that I was on solid ground. But no, I think, the case is ongoing, certainly. And I think that I would love to keep adding chapters with every passing month. But in terms of the actual cohesion of the facts in the book, I think they speak for themselves in a way that readers will be able to draw their own conclusions.
I was particularly fascinated with some of what you found related to Mark. He has been a thorn in my side for a very long time.
Tell me more about that.
With his suicide. Hold on. Dogs. Even they see me start talking and moving, they want to.
I think they're growling because they don't like Mark Ivanitz. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, that's what I think they're doing.
I'm back. I'm sorry.
Okay. We're dealing with Tiger. If you'd like to have a dog.
I looked at my cameras and Fanny was out in the chicken yard, and I was like, what is the dog doing in the chicken yard? And so I had to run out real quick. They had opened the gate. This has never happened. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Because I'm like waiting for them to start eating the chickens, right? And so I got them back inside, so we're good. But I was like, are you kidding me? I was like, what is that thing in the chicken yard? And I can see everything in my office. And so I keep an eye on stuff. And I was like, that looks really weird. That shouldn't be there. And then I was like, it's the dog. Oh my goodness.
So as you can tell, I'm a very skilled audio editor because we have a lot that goes on that does not make it into the show. Chickens and dogs. And
it's amazing that sometimes after we record, I'm like, I can't believe you actually got a show out of that because it's so crazy.
So we had just gotten to Mark Ivanitz.
Ivanitz.
Yes, the alternate suspect to Darrell. And what I was telling her was when we first started, our first season was because Meg and I are completely obsessed with Israel Keys. We've been obsessed with Israel Keys since the moment they started talking about him. That was something we had spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of effort on trying to figure out what the FBI missed there. I know there's other podcasts that have covered him in one-offs, and there's a whole couple seasons of another podcast. But that, my obsession with Israel Keys is what kicked all of this off. Mm-hmm. And probably a very close second to Israel Keys, I have a little group of like 3 killers, and one of them is Neil Falls, who his last victim killed him, and the other is Mark Ivanitz, because he called, and I will never forget this. It's stuck in my head. He, tells his sister right before he kills himself,
Mm-hmm.
the time that he would be caught. In that time, he decides to say he can't even tell her because how much he's done, because the victims are too many to count.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Mm-hmm.
words "too many to count" like stick in my head.
Well, and I believe him.
And I totally believe
so do
him.
we. Yeah, definitely.
We have a whole list. Like that's going to be our next
he's really
round.
Scary.
Well, Deirdre Enright and I have been looking at a couple of other murders in particular now, and I have a list of women that he was pursuing, some of whom he actually ended up meeting in person, and some he was just pursuing online. And if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I would be very happy to provide you their names and what we know of their contact information, because we have not yet had the time to account for all of them and make sure they're still alive.
Well, we would love to have anything that you have about him. Yeah,
we
definitely.
have a list, and so believe it or not, my list actually comes from some of Deirdre's students. And it's not a list of victims. It's a time like a timeline of his life that's put together from mostly official documents. And I've been going through verifying this list, and we have discovered that he is far more terrifying than Israel Keys.
I think so. One of the big things about Israel Keys was that he was one of the only confessed but not convicted serial killers, because he killed himself while he was awaiting trial. The trial hadn't been set or anything, but he had confessed to 3 murders and more, but no details were given. And it drove me crazy that he was this confessed but not convicted serial killer. And it looks like with Mark, I feel like it's the same type of thing, which I don't know that he's confessed, but we've got the witnesses, the witness talking about what he did to her, and then the girls that his DNA was linked to their cases, right? And so it's almost like a confession, and then he killed himself and he wasn't convicted, right?
Yeah, and what I find utterly beguiling is the fact that once the FBI and the state police got into his apartment, which is like a horror show, right? With locks of women's hair and disc cases and a chest filled with women's panties. And and notes of like other people he had been pursuing. The FBI very briefly had convened a task force, and they were looking at murders that had happened as far away as San Diego. And then for reasons that the FBI has not explained, very quickly after this task force was convened, it was disbanded. And not only was it disbanded, but the senior ranking FBI official sent out a very pointed memo saying, under no circumstances will you continue to pursue Ivanitz and any other violent crimes. And how and why that happened has never been explained to me, because certainly, there's more than enough reason to at least investigate him and several other crimes, one in particular here in Maine that we're looking at right now.
Really? I don't think we included Maine in our
I've included Maine, but I did include California. Ours go all the way back to 1981 right now.
Mm-hmm.
There was an April 12, 1998 Henrico County, Virginia disappearance of a young girl that I'm fairly certain is his, and I haven't told anybody. Meg knows about this one. She's just driving along and stops at a bridge, and because she stopped her car at the bridge, the cops were like, "Oh, she killed herself. She's a young girl." Except we think he pulled the same ruse he may have pulled earlier, which was, "Hey, there's something wrong with your car. Let me take you. We'll take you back to the station, and I'll come back and help you with your car." Put a napkin under the windshield type thing.
Right, Route 29. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think he was active. I think he was active before his arrest for, indecent exposure and lewd conduct charge. And I think he's probably responsible all the way back to 1981, 1982. I could derail our entire interview with Mark
Don't do that.
Ivanitz because like I'm so fascinated by him. But I will say that is the point that I would love to keep in touch with you on
100%
forward in our stuff, because he makes me fear the world. People like that.
Deirdre and I have been working on this case that was in the late 80s here in Maine. Sarah Cherry is the name of the victim. And it goes down very much like the Lisk sisters, Sophia Silva, and then Kara Robinson, the young woman who managed to escape. The MO is identical to those. And it happened in this very tiny little town here in Maine called Bodenham, which is about 10 minutes away from the Bath Ironworks shipyard, which is where Ivanitz was stationed in the Navy on a ship called the Kolsch. And the Kolsch was in dry dock at BIW at the time. And so Ivanitz was living 10 minutes away from where this murder occurred. It's exactly the other way these other ones go down. And this man named Dennis DeShane was arrested, and no one in the state of Maine, other than whoever convicted him, seems willing to say that he's actually guilty. And so Ivanitz has been on the radar of the coalition of folks who are working on the Free Dennis DeShane campaign. And, we've dug back in as well, too, because it just every single detail just seems to scream his name.
Yeah. And, that case, they have DNA from under her fingernails that doesn't match Dennis. And that's one of the reasons that I never thought of it until you said it just now. I had not looked at Ivanitz for that. I just remember that case.
Well, because we look at like missing people because of Israel Key's like big question mark at the end of his saga, right? And so when cases have been solved, it takes us a little bit longer to get back around when they're relevant, right? Because we're looking at people who are just missing, like they haven't been murdered and found. And then, of course, they don't have people convicted for it, right? So it takes a little bit longer, but that's interesting. I'm going to have to check that case out now. So
I'm just going to move back to Trailed for a minute because we were promoting Trailed today. So okay. Sorry about that. I will get distracted and we will not come back if I don't focus.
Well, I don't know how far you guys got before I had to run out, but I had a question. I agree that the park administration, or I'm not really sure, that the National Park Service, the guys that were in charge when they found the crime scene where these girls had been murdered, it was catastrophic that they made the decisions that they did. And so I find myself in the middle of cases all the time asking myself, is this a case of like incompetence or is it malfeasance? Like, so do you have any idea if like they were just so overwhelmed with what they were facing that they were like, we can't possibly scare everybody with this? Or do you feel like, I guess, what do you think the intention behind that was? Were they so surprised that they didn't act, or were they like consciously covering it up?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I try to draw a distinction in the book between individuals and institutions, right? I think,
Sure.
By and large, all of the individuals who worked this case were really, they were dutiful, they were responsible, they were engaged, they were doing the best they can. Institutionally, there were these incredible challenges getting placed on people. And the National Park Service, even today, has a multi-billion-dollar deficit that they refer to as deferred maintenance, which is basically just consistently woefully underfunding the national parks. And so not only does that mean that washed out roads don't get repaired, but it also means that rangers don't get rehired, vacant positions don't get filled, rangers don't get the training and the equipment that they need. And that had already become a really big problem in Shenandoah by 1996. You know, the rangers' radios didn't even work. They couldn't even communicate with each other. So part of it, I think, is that there had been a fairly high profile murder that had been sort of tangentially linked to the Clinton administration that had just occurred on National Park Service land in Washington, D.C. And then the National Park Service had really been kind of called out on the rug in front of Congress for that. So there was a lot of pressure. But then there was also this pressure to keep numbers really high in the park and keep visitors and revenue streaming in. And so I think that conflation of everything led to this very short-sighted decision on their part.
I guess I just like to reassure myself that, like, certainly if they could look back on it, they would make different decisions. Because
And they
I
did
like
say
to
that to
think,
me when I did interview the two
Okay.
folks primarily responsible. They did definitely, they do have regret now, I think.
Right. And a lot of times I feel like it's just a matter of like somebody else saying it out loud to them or to me when I'm the one, that's mistaken. When somebody says it out loud to me, I'm like, wow, you're absolutely right. That was crazy that I did that. And so I think that would be, I'm glad to hear that was their response to you about it, because I do feel like they didn't want anybody else to get hurt. We'd like to think that at least they didn't want anybody, out there with a serial killer. They were, I guess, so shocked and just trying to do the best they could with this horrible situation.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a surprise at this point that I'm pretty hard on the FBI in this book, and I really stand by that. But I am much less hard, I think, on the National Park Service as an institution. It's just, again, been underfunded and undertreated. And one of the things that I sort of point out in one of the set pieces of the book is not only how underfunded the National Park Service is, and how sort of hamstringed they are because of that. But also, the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior has no codified system for either reporting or responding to violent crime. It's sort of this ad hoc, park by park basis. And as I point out in the book, not only are violent crimes underreported in this country, and missing persons. You all probably saw the article that Outside Magazine did a few years ago trying to trace just how many thousands of people have gone missing on public land. And the numbers are really staggering. And so we just, as a country, we don't have a system that demands that rangers report violent crime, that they investigate violent crime, that they pull in, peer institutions, whether it's state police or the FBI or whatever else. And so as a country, we don't even really know what we're dealing with here in terms of how pervasive these crimes are.
It makes it that much scarier. Something you said I think is important here, because I rail on the FBI all the time. The individuals that I know in the FBI, and we have several Park Service people, the individuals are absolutely standout individuals in doing their jobs and investigating. Sounds very similar to some of the characters that you do a pretty amazing job in the books. In the book, covering one character in particular and a back and forth relationship that gets volatile at times, but they're human beings. These guys are, I may rail on the institutions, but the human beings in these cases are very heavily affected by even one of these crimes, let alone some of these gentlemen were at the scene of multiple crimes that occurred in Virginia at different parks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about one particular. There was a crew of four, and you sort of mentioned them in the books. Did you, beyond Ivanitz as a suspect, who I think is a great possibility. It's not that I'm sold or not sold on him. It's just very difficult to put him in that place and time right now. Did you give any stock to there being possibly among the good humans a corrupt member of the ranks who could have done this, like someone who worked in the parks?
Yeah, I mean, again, the FBI in the months after the murder, the FBI had several suspects, one of whom was a very strong suspect who were Rangers. There were multiple Rangers who had worked both the 86 Colonial Parkway murder and then also the Shenandoah murder. One in particular really kind of caught the attention of the FBI. I certainly followed that. There were two Rangers that I name in the book who did not speak to me, who refused to speak to me, one of whom kind of got himself into some pretty significant trouble in the Grand Canyon. And that is detailed in several books that have been written by whistleblowers. And then the Ranger who also discovered the bodies of the two women after dusk in a hidden campsite. That's never been fully explained to me either. Both of those Rangers got themselves into some trouble with some sort of procedural problems and kind of overextending their authority. And I kind of paint that in the book as well. And I'll certainly leave it up to readers to decide who they think did it. And that was really kind of one of my aims of the book was to kind of allow armchair detectives, and then I count myself among those, to kind of say, okay, well, here are the facts. What conclusion do I want to draw?
You did a really great job.
Yeah, I mean, that technique worked marvelously and also drives me crazy. But
well, I would love it. I mean, this is not over, right? This is ongoing. And so I'm not done with this case. And so I would love it if, podcast listeners, if readers, wanted to chime in with their thoughts and kind of join the team here, because by all accounts, the 1996 Shenandoah murders and arguably the 86 Colonial Parkway murders and others are eminently solvable, closable cases. And so maybe it really takes a village of all of us working together to get that done.
Really quick, you talk with you got to visit the forensic lab, the FBI forensic lab, and one of the, I can't remember the name, but it had been posited to you that perhaps some DNA evidence was going to make a difference in this case as technology advanced. And that one of the head forensic DNA analysis said, well, I'm not really sure what that person's talking about because I don't see that happening. Were you under the impression that I felt like there was a disconnect there? And because to me, if they have a DNA profile from Lolly and Julie's crime scene, it seems like they would be doing everything possible to identify who that DNA belongs to, like as far as, genetic genealogy goes, where they're sort of doing a backwards tree on it. And I was really confused that, the analyst would have said, well, I don't know what he's talking about. And I wasn't sure if you got any more information out of that. Like, do they just not have any more samples or?
Yeah, and in this particular case, at this time, here we are, 2022, I can't say what they have left for samples. But one of the things that I didn't know and I thought was really interesting was, we've got this amazing FBI forensic lab at Quantico, but they don't decide what they do. They have to get a request from an investigating FBI agent. And that's only when the DNA or whatever else gets tested. And so they don't test unless the agent requests it. And in the case of Shenandoah, after some of the DNA was tested and it came back resoundingly not Darrell Rice, and then, based on FBI lab criteria, Ivanitz could not be ruled out because on a mitochondrial DNA test, his DNA matched in 799 out of 800 positions. At that point, the agent should have automatically, following FBI protocol, said, rerun this DNA against Ivanitz again. And instead, the agent said, do not rerun Ivanitz, rerun Darrell Rice. And again, was that malfeasance or carelessness? I can't say, but it's one of those decisive moments in this case where I think things could have taken a right-hand turn and gone very differently.
They absolutely could have. To me, it was unbelievable. Just reading those words, like, are you kidding me?
If I know I can put your website into the show notes, do you have like IndieBound or a favorite place where people can go and get this book to read?
I love that you said IndieBound. I am such a huge supporter of independent bookstores. And so that's always my go-to place. But I will say, this amazing actress named Gabra Zuckman, who did the audio for I'll Be Gone in the Dark, did the audio book for Trailed. And I have to say that even having written it and edited it and lived with this book for 4 years, I get goosebumps listening to her read the audio book.
Is that going to be on Audible? Do you know?
It is,
Gabra?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll make sure I will put that all in the show notes so people can catch up with you. I know we're running out of time. I have one last question. You did an amazing job covering the personal relationships between Lolly and Julie, and I'm sure some of that stayed with you. This is a loaded question. I always save those for last after we plug the book. How did you feel about them not being able to choose to be out in terms of their sexuality?
Yeah. Yeah. And, they were outed in such an awful way. They were literally outed on the front page of most national newspapers an hour before their respective funerals. And that was profoundly painful for the families involved. And, they told me, like, listen, it's not painful to us that our daughters were in a lesbian relationship. It's painful that this is what happened. And I had a lot of kind of hard come to Jesus conversations with myself about what of their personal lives to include. And in the end, having had their journals, having had photographs and letters and things that they had written, I tried to stick with only those parts of their personal lives that I felt were particularly relevant to the case at hand so that I could try to protect their privacy whenever I could.
I think you did an amazing job. I wanted to compliment you on that last, because I think if you hadn't done it, it would have made all the Reddit boys bring it up again and drag them through the muck again.
Well, it makes it like trying to hide it is almost worse than not addressing it. And I think you did a very good job. It was a very eloquently pieced together. And I think that, if it had to be in a bad way or in sort of not their own way, you did a good job.
Thank you. They're just such extraordinary humans, and I think the whole planet is all the worse because they didn't get to continue all of this good work they were doing. And so if in some tiny way I can pay homage to who they are, then I feel good about that for sure.
Well, thank you for joining us. This is Kathryn Miles. Her new book is called Trailed. You should definitely check it out. It is a great read, and it is here just in time for summer reading, but I think most people probably want to pick it up again and read it a second time, because I know I've already started my third round on this book because it's fascinating. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for spending some time with us talking about this.
Oh, it really is my pleasure. This is a great podcast, and I can't wait to keep listening as a subscriber.
I wish I had known before the interview that was available on Audible, because I think I would have done that. I listen to things a lot. Do you listen to things?
I do.
Yeah. I really enjoyed having her on. I enjoyed reading her book, and I hope that the book does really well.
Me too. I feel like that kind of devotion is a treasure.
It really is. Well, you and I argue about other true crime authors sometimes. There's been people, without naming any names, that you and I sort of look at it and we go, we liked the book, but they did this one thing.
Right. And whenever there's we've learned so much from doing this show. And one of the things is that, like, you should never just buy into anybody's narrative, right?
Right.
And I think that when there's a factual discrepancy in something that I know versus what an author has written, I think I take it way too personally. And this doesn't apply with Trailed, but in discussions we have about other authors, I feel like I like sort of go, well, what, they don't even know what they're talking about, right? When I see this factual error in something. And that's not a great attitude to have, because I feel like people make mistakes. In everything you do, little mistakes happen. And I I feel like with Trailed in particular, it lays out a lot of factual information without drawing too many conclusions.
I would agree with that. I mean, she left it open. I like the way she left it open. She even states that she left it open kind of on purpose for the reader to be able to draw their own inferences throughout. I like that. I think that's probably my favorite kind of true crime.
I think so too. And I think that, part of doing our show has been, more of the talk part of it, where we're not just sort of, just regurgitating the stories of true crime that make their way around the true crime industry, right? We want to have something to add to it or to take away from it or something, right? We don't just want to be talking about people's unfortunate true crime incidents just to be talking about them. And I feel like that book did a really good job of that, because it actually brought quite a few things up that, you wouldn't normally consider when you're considering that case. At least me.
I definitely agree with that.
And because of the age on the case, I didn't draw all those connections. I kind of doubt you did either, but I don't know that for certain. All the connections that are made throughout the story, I don't know that I would have independently drawn those conclusions.
I didn't have the information that she had, so I had drawn a lot less conclusions.
Okay, well that could be it too. It could just be that, like, I wouldn't have had the information either, but it was presented in a way that it logically takes on sort of this life of its own, and it brings all these different things together.
Julie and Lolly were all too aware of the repressive zeitgeist of that time. And so that new, crazy love they felt was also something they kept almost entirely private. Out in the world, they traveled as good friends, just two young women who happened to share a passion for wild places. That passion was what had taken them down Shenandoah National Park's Skyland Meadows Bridle Trail in May 1996. Located just 2 hours from our nation's capital, Shenandoah National Park feels a lot more remote. On a map, its 196,000 acres of forest look like a lizard sprawled along the narrow ridge of Virginia's Shenandoah Mountains. Slicing through the middle of this long stretch of green is Skyline Drive, the only significant paved road in the park. During the height of the summer season, Skyline Drive is thronged with visitors who flock to its postcard-perfect overlooks, resorts, and picnic areas. But get a mile beyond the drive on either side, and the park can seem as wild as any remote western landscape. Decades earlier, the bridle trail had been well used, a thoroughfare for the nearby Skyland Resort stables, a place where parades of families were led on trail rides day after day. In time, stable managers decided crossing busy Skyline Drive was too dangerous for novice riders, so they relocated their horse trail behind the resort complex. In the years following, Virginia's abounding foliage, first serviceberry and interrupting ferns, then tickseed, wild blackberries, and poplar shoots, began to overtake the path. The trail slipped off park maps entirely. By the time Julie and Lolly arrived, all that remained was an unimpressive concrete marker on the edge of the park's main road. No bigger than a Civil War gravestone, it floated half-submerged in a tangle of grass and weeds. Despite the overgrown terrain and lack of obvious markers, Lolly and Julie somehow found their way to the hidden Bridle Trail trailhead. Weighed down by overstuffed backpacks, they slowly descended eastward. A quarter mile down the steep path, they, along with Lolly's golden retriever mix, Taj, turned left and bushwhacked 200 yards through the understory. There they reached the northern fork of the White Oak Canyon stream. The women set up their tent, stacked their heavy packs one upon another. They hung their water purifier, draped the tent's blue and yellow rainfly, and staked it to the ground. They were so far hidden, even the bright nylon of that rainfly would have seemed barely a whisper through all the early season growth. Maybe a resting goldfinch or jay, if you noticed it at all. He noticed, and he came prepared. He brought with him gloves, along with duct tape, and at least one weapon. He bound and gagged the women, then separated them. He left Lolly in their tent, He brought Julie, along with her sleeping blanket and pad, to the edge of the creek. When he was done with them, he killed both women with a single, unhesitating knife stroke to their throats. And then he disappeared, seemingly without a trace.
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabbratiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabbratiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
Now, I did want to just sort of say outright, and we may have already said outright, I know that it's been posited that this is the kind of thing that Israel Keys might have done, but I feel really confident in saying that Lolly and Julie's murder, I don't think we can attribute it to Israel Keys in any way because it's just too early.
Oh, yeah, he's not on my list. I mean, so there was this whole thing early on where I was like, what if we got the timeline wrong? And realistically, but the thing is, he's 17 years old.
Okay, so he would be 18.
This is a pretty sophisticated crime for someone who would have been as young as Israel Keys. But I'll tell you, man, when I first heard him talking about couples, this was one of the couples that immediately jumped into
out.
my mind. Yeah.
Right. And he would have been 18. He also, at that point in time, he was still on the other side of the country without a whole lot of means to find himself in Shenandoah Valley. I mean, that's my understanding of the situation anyway. But I thought about it from the perspective of when he was doing his interviews and when we nailed down the timeline. I don't see this murder of Julie and Lolly happening the way that it did, and then him having the Mopin incident after that.
Yeah, because theoretically this would have been, the Mopin incident would have had to have happened a year before if this has anything to do with it. If I try really hard to entertain people, I can come up with a way to entertain people with Israel Keys being a possibility here. It's just not realistic. It's pure speculation, and it's highly unlikely he would have been this sophisticated at 18 years old.
I agree. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there because I don't want it to be a point of confusion, just in case. This is a case where two women were murdered in a remote area, right?
Yeah.
At least that's my assumption. I've never been to this national park, and sort of it was a little confusing in the book because they talk about this resort being there, and then I've looked at the map, sort of, but as far as I can tell, it was still remote, right? Even though there is sort of a lot of activity happening.
It's a weird. Anytime you get into these national parks in Virginia, so on your eastern side, they are remote, but they're still close to things. If that makes sense,
right?
And then if you go to the west, that's where you get really remote. If you were to go out George Washington and Jefferson, as opposed to Shenandoah, those are truly remote Appalachian trail places, if that makes sense.
Right.
Hold on. Now I'm messing it up because I was sorry. In between us talking to her and now, I'm thinking about Gary Michael Hilton because that's who I wanted to mention here. But this is a remote area. This is attached to the Appalachian Trail. Anything attached to the Appalachian Trail, for the most part, is more remote. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I just felt like because of some of the criteria that we looked at kind of extensively for Key's cases, I it's at least my opinion, I don't even entertain that it might be Israel Keyes responsible for this. He was too young. It's in the wrong geographical location for me. And it like you said, there's no way he was this sophisticated at that age.
Yeah.
In fact, at that age, he was still developing the hatred that led to what he ended up being.
I would agree with that 100%. I think he might have had the skills to do some of it, but I just don't see this. Gary Michael Hilton pops up. He was suspected of being active as early as, the mid 90s. Because I think of the case of Judy Smith. Do you know what I'm talking about? That was the woman that was found in North Carolina in 97.
Where was she?
She was a nurse from up in Massachusetts, but she was found in Pisgah National Forest.
Oh, I do think I vaguely remember that.
Yeah, if you looked her up, I think that one would. She was found in September of 1997, but she had been missing since earlier in the year. She was a woman who went missing from Philadelphia. Her case is very interesting, and at some point we should go in a little deeper on her case and talk about it with the next round of what we're doing. I have one last question though. Do you think Lolly and Julie's murder was a hate crime?
I don't.
I don't either.
And that's not too. I think we covered an episode, and I believe it was named "Season of Hate."
Mm-hmm.
And in that episode, we talk about how if everything's a hate crime, then nothing's a hate crime, right?
Yeah.
And while I do think that it would be absolutely relevant if it was a hate crime, I find it really hard to believe that, especially because it would be against their sexual orientation. It would be hate against a lesbian couple, right? Or I guess it could just be gender hatred, right? I don't see how this type of situation, just all the circumstances surrounding the case based on, them traveling through there, it being a national park, they're camping out, how on earth could they have come across them and had that particular motive, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. No matter how you look at it, that's always been one of my issues with. I sort of think you do a disservice to these particular victims if you focus on that and say, "Oh, this was a hate crime." Because in some regards, this is a hate crime.
Well, I was going to say, I think all murders have an element of hate to them. Don't get me wrong.
There's a rage crime.
Sure, to murder another person, there's hate happening there, but just the way it's sort of delineated where there's nothing else going on except a particular dislike towards a behavior, right?
Yeah.
Something about a person is making you want to kill them. And it, usually has to do with race or gender or sexual orientation. And it's the worst of the worst, right? It's a really bad thing to kind of tag on to a murder. And I would be the first to say, if I thought it applied here, I just can't see how it's possible unless it becomes somehow more linked to them, where it's
more personal,
not as random as it seems like it is.
You got that hotter than a summertime in July. Time magic, and I got to have it. I got to say it again. Oh my, you got that hotter than a summertime in July. Time magic, and I got to have it. Ooh baby, you're my sugar dripping, chocolate covered waffle cone. No, I can't can't leave that boy alone. Need a taste up in the morning. You got a girl just jonesing. Need a fix from my favorite type of candy store. Got me shaking, going out of control. Let me have a little something. You know I'm hooked up on that loving. Let's rock, rock, roller skate. Let the stress just slide away. Oh baby, no, don't ever let me go. No, don't ever let me go. Champagne, let's celebrate. Let that old school record play. Oh baby, no, don't ever let me go. No, don't ever let me go. Oh my, you got that hotter than the summertime in July. Time magic, and I got to have it. I got to say it again. Oh my, you got that hotter than the summertime in July. Time magic, and I got to have it. Ooh, baby. You got me feeling like I'm overheating in the shade. There's a rise up in the centigrade. Need a taste to keep me going. You know you keep a girl jonesing. I need a hit, keep it coming, ain't no antidote. One kiss, that's all she wrote. I'm an addict, I confess it. Ooh,